I knew this was going to be the kind of story people argue about on the internet the moment I walked outside and realized my driveway, the one I poured, sealed, paid for, and parked on for 10 straight years, had vanished behind a stranger's car like it suddenly belonged to someone else. The air felt heavier than the summer heat, and my heart punched my ribs as I saw her standing there, arms crossed, sunglasses on, chin tilted like a queen guarding conquered land. That was the first time I heard the words that would spark everything. It's HOA property now. Park somewhere else. I didn't yell. I didn't swear. I didn't even step forward. Instead, I just stared at the deep tire marks cutting across my concrete like scars, and I thought about every long shift, every late night, every time I came home exhausted and pulled into this exact place. This wasn't just pavement. It was ownership. It was security. And in that moment, it was stolen. She introduced herself like it was an honor. Karen, the newest HOA board member. She said there'd been a boundary update, a reallocation, and that my driveway now counted as a shared neighborhood access zone. But the smirk on her face told the real story long before her excuses did. This wasn't policy. This was power. She had found a rule to twist, and she was going to twist it until it snapped. Every word she spoke sounded like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. Every gesture felt intentional. When she pointed at her car sitting across my driveway like a barricade, I felt my patience drain, one slow drop at a time. I didn't respond. I just took out my phone, opened the camera, and recorded the scene in silence. Because some fights aren't won by shouting. They're won by evidence, patience, and timing. And in that moment, I made a decision not to argue, not to threaten, but to plan. What she didn't know was that my driveway wasn't the only thing I'd invested in. I had time. I had receipts. And soon, I'd have karma on my side. Before long, she would learn the one rule you never break. You don't take what doesn't belong to you. And walk away without consequences. The next morning began with the quiet kind of tension that feels like a storm deciding whether or not to break. I stood at my window, watching Karen's car still sprawled across my driveway like a trophy she refused to return. The street was calm, but beneath that calm, something sharper was forming inside me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I printed every document I owned: property survey, purchase agreement, HOA charter, city zoning file. One by one, I stacked them across my kitchen table like chess pieces before a match. Every line I highlighted told a slightly different truth than the one Karen had tried to sell me. My driveway wasn't shared. It wasn't communal. It was recorded, measured, and legally mine. But winning on paper wasn't enough. Karen didn't respect paper. She respected spectacle. So I waited until she came outside, sunglasses on, coffee in hand, acting like blocking my home was part of her daily routine. I walked over slowly, carrying nothing but a calm smile and a clipboard thick with documents. When I spoke, my voice was steady. I told her I had reviewed the maps. I told her the city would be notified. I told her the police would see a vehicle trespassing on private property. She laughed, not because she thought I was wrong, but because she believed the HOA made her untouchable. That laugh sealed everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply nodded and went back inside, letting silence do the talking. Then I began making calls: city code enforcement, non-emergency police, property records. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't threaten. I just reported exactly what stood in front of my house. By sunset, word had already started traveling through the neighborhood. Curtains shifted. Phones buzzed. Karen stood beside her car, irritated now, pacing like someone who had finally realized a fuse was burning somewhere and she couldn't see how long it was. I wasn't seeking revenge for ego. I was seeking accountability. And accountability was about to arrive, slow, patient, and undeniable. Because when people like Karen believe rules bend for them, they never expect someone to follow every rule precisely and use it like a mirror. I documented timestamps, photographed every angle, and printed copies for officials so there would be no room for excuses or revision. The truth was no longer a disagreement between neighbors, it was a record, and records have a way of stripping away arrogance. The more I prepared, the calmer I felt, because I knew the moment her confidence cracked, the story would finally shift. And when it shifted, there would be no turning back now. On the third afternoon, blue lights rolled slowly down our street, quiet but impossible to ignore, and every curtain in the neighborhood lifted at once. Karen stood beside my driveway like a guard refusing to step aside, but I could see the tightness in her jaw when the officer stepped out and studied the scene. I waited on my porch, calm and patient, a folder of photographs and records resting in my hands. The officer asked whose vehicle it was. Karen spoke first, insisting that the driveway was community property, that she was acting under HOA authority, that I was being dramatic. Her voice sounded confident, but her eyes kept drifting toward my paperwork. I walked forward and passed him the survey map, the deed, the zoning sheet, every page highlighted with quiet precision. He read each line twice before turning back to Karen. His tone was measured, but final, when he explained that the property line was clear and that her vehicle was trespassing. The street felt silent enough to hear the wind move across the trees. Karen tried to argue, but every sentence sounded smaller than the evidence stacked between us. The officer issued a citation and asked her to relocate the car immediately. She hesitated, then climbed inside and reversed out of my driveway for the first time since this began. The marks her tires left behind looked faint, almost embarrassed. I didn't celebrate or smile. I simply thanked the officer and returned to my porch, letting the moment settle across the street like dust after a storm. Neighbors whispered from doorways, realizing that the story they had been hearing from Karen wasn't the truth after all. But the lesson wasn't finished yet. Removing the car meant the driveway was free, not that the arrogance behind it had disappeared. I knew that people who hate being proven wrong rarely admit defeat, they search for another angle, another rule to bend. And I could feel that stubbornness still burning beneath her silence. So I kept documenting, organizing every message, every policy note, every moment this conflict touched my home. Not out of spite, but because justice is strongest when the truth stands unshakable in daylight. And deep down, I sensed that the biggest turn in this story hadn't happened yet. Yet I sensed her pride waiting to strike again, and I prepared myself for whatever boundary she tried to cross next, because this fight wasn't over. Karen didn't take the citation as a warning, she took it as a challenge. By the next week, quiet tension had crept back into the neighborhood, subtle but unmistakable, like a storm rebuilding after pretending to pass. She stopped blocking my driveway, but she didn't step away from the fight. Instead, she began showing up at HOA meetings with stacks of papers and an audience of neighbors who didn't yet know which side of the story to believe. I attended every single one, sitting near the back, calm, collected, and silent the way a person sits when they know the truth doesn't need theatrics to stand upright. Karen spoke with confidence, painting herself as a defender of order, insisting that the neighborhood needed uniformity, that certain properties, specifically mine, should contribute more to shared access. Her tone was polite. Her words were wrapped in formality. But under all of it, I could still hear the same entitlement that once parked across my concrete like a flag planted on conquered land. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. Instead, I waited until the board asked if anyone else would like to speak. When I stood, I placed my binder on the table and opened it, not with anger but precision. Every photograph, timestamp, ordinance, boundary record, and violation notice sat arranged like a story that didn't need exaggeration. The room grew quiet as I explained everything slowly, carefully, fact by fact. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't emotional. I was undeniable. Board members leaned forward. Neighbors whispered. Karen's confidence flickered, the way a light does when the power source starts to fail. And when the board requested an independent property review, she finally understood that this was no longer a personal clash or a debate she could twist. It was process, and process doesn't take sides. Over the next few days, surveyors walked my property with careful steps, measuring markers, confirming boundaries, verifying that every inch of that driveway belonged to me and had always belonged to me. When the official report arrived, it didn't scold, accuse, or dramatize. It simply confirmed the truth in quiet, irrefutable language. The board voted. The decision was final. My driveway was mine permanently and unquestionably. Karen didn't speak when the result was read. She only stared ahead, still as stone, while the weight of consequence finally settled where arrogance once lived. And as I walked out of that room, I realized something: this story wasn't just about property. It was about pride, boundaries, and what happens when someone refuses to respect either. The neighborhood changed after that vote, not loudly, not suddenly, but with a slow, unmistakable shift, like a tide pulling back from the shore. People greeted me differently. Conversations softened. And for the first time since this began, my driveway sat empty, untouched, and undeniably mine. But victory didn't erase what Karen had done, it only revealed how deeply she hated losing. She stopped waving to neighbors. She avoided eye contact. And every time I saw her pass my house, her expression carried that tight, simmering resentment of someone who believed consequences were personal insults instead of lessons. I thought maybe the situation would settle, that quiet would return with time. But entitlement rarely leaves quietly. Within a week, Karen began parking her car so close to the edge of my property line that it created a bottleneck at the curb. Never technically illegal, always intentionally inconvenient. It was her message: she couldn't take my driveway anymore, but she would make sure I felt her presence. I didn't respond. I didn't confront her. I went inside, sat at my desk, and remembered the officer's words, the report, the citation, the pattern. People like Karen don't learn from correction, they learn from escalation meeting structure. So instead of reacting, I began planning something different, something patient, lawful, and unforgettable. I reviewed parking regulations, neighborhood ordinances, and municipal guidelines. I learned where vehicles could and couldn't be left, how long they could stay, and what happened when someone repeatedly turned public streets into personal territory. The rules were clear. They always had been. Karen had simply assumed no one else would bother reading them. So I documented every obstructive park, every curb block, every moment she treated shared space like a chessboard she owned. I didn't interrupt her pattern. I let it write itself. And as the record grew longer, my resolve became sharper, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Revenge, to me, wasn't chaos. It was accountability delivered with precision. One evening, after yet another staged near block at my curb, I walked outside with the same calm patience I had carried since the beginning. I took a slow, deliberate set of photographs, each one framed, time-stamped, undeniable. Then I made a single call, not to argue, not to complain, but to report a repeated violation pattern affecting traffic and property access. This time, the response wouldn't arrive as a warning. It would arrive as a message she would never forget. They didn't send a single cruiser this time, they sent a tow inspector, a code officer, and a quiet certainty that made the entire street feel smaller. They arrived just after sunrise, when the sky was pale and the neighborhood still waking up, and Karen's car sat wedged along the curb with that same deliberate, almost blocking placement she thought made her untouchable. I watched from my porch as the inspector traced the curb with a measuring wheel, noting the obstruction, the distance from the junction, the documented pattern of repeat violations I had prepared like a timeline carved in stone. Karen came outside in a rush, robe tied tight, voice sharp, disbelief spilling out before anyone even spoke to her. She insisted it was public street. She insisted she wasn't blocking anything. She insisted this was harassment. But this time, no one reacted to the noise. They reacted to the record. The officer read each violation aloud, step by step, like a story she couldn't rewrite. Warnings issued, citations logged, photos matched to timestamps. With every line, her confidence thinned, peeling away until only the truth remained. When the tow truck turned onto our street, its engine sounded like a verdict. The operator was calm, professional, unbothered by the shouting that followed. Chains clinked against steel, the winch tightened, and for the first time, Karen realized the one thing she had never considered, that consequences weren't personal, but procedural. The car lifted slowly, almost ceremonially, rising off the pavement as neighbors watched from doorways, silent witnesses to a moment months in the making. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply stood still, feeling the weight of patience settle into something steady, not triumph, but closure. The officer handed her paperwork, explained the impound fees, the repeat offender penalties, the review of her behavior by the HOA board she once commanded like a personal stage. Karen's voice faltered, then broke into quiet anger, the kind that no longer sounded powerful, only exposed. As the truck pulled away, the street felt wider, cleaner, lighter. My driveway wasn't threatened. My curb wasn't a battleground. It was simply a place where rules finally meant what they were written to mean. And in that stillness, I understood something important. Revenge hadn't been the tow truck, or the citation, or the stunned silence. Revenge had been patience, truth, and every careful step that led here. That morning, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet, as if everyone was waiting to see what Karen would do next, and whether the lesson that arrived on the back of a tow truck had finally settled into something real. Instead of gloating, I spent the day walking my property, breathing in the quiet, and letting the tension of the last few weeks loosen from my shoulders. Yet even in relief, I sensed the story wasn't finished, because conflict doesn't vanish when the noise stops, it lingers, looking for a new place to rest. That evening, Karen knocked on my door, not with arrogance, but with a hesitant, uneven breath. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, and she asked if we could talk. We stood on the porch, where the air smelled faintly of rain, and she admitted that losing control frightened her more than losing the driveway. She said she had spent years believing that authority made her respected, when it had only made her feared. I didn't lecture. I listened. Sometimes silence can be kinder than correction, and for the first time, she seemed willing to see beyond herself. We sat on the steps, and I told her that boundaries were never meant to humiliate anyone, they existed so people could live beside one another without turning every disagreement into a battlefield. She nodded, slowly, like someone learning how to breathe again. When she apologized, it wasn't dramatic or rehearsed, it was quiet, imperfect, and honest. I accepted, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because moving forward requires more strength than standing still. The street felt different that night, softer, almost human. The lesson had reached further than consequences, it had reached the heart of the conflict itself, where pride finally gave way to responsibility. I realized revenge had transformed into resolution, and resolution into something quieter: respect. Over the following days the neighborhood adjusted to the quiet, and small gestures replaced tension, a wave from across the street, a slower pace at the mailbox, a shared acknowledgement that we had all watched something change. Karen began attending meetings not to dominate, but to listen, volunteering for projects that actually helped people instead of policing them. I didn't become her friend, but I became her neighbor again, and that difference mattered. My driveway remained where it always belonged, yet the real boundary restored was invisible, the simple understanding that power means little when it forgets humility, and that patience, when used carefully, can build something stronger than victory, it can build trust. And in that renewed calm, the story finally felt complete, resting where fairness and accountability had always intended it to end, for us all. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly found its balance again, like a street relearning how to breathe after months of tension. The conflict that once hovered over our block now lingered only as a memory, not loud, not bitter, but cautionary. My driveway stood untouched, unchallenged, and every time I pulled in after a long day, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt ownership restored, and peace earned through patience rather than anger. Karen kept her distance at first, not out of hostility, but out of reflection. The confidence she once wore like armor had softened into something quieter: awareness. She stopped using rules as weapons and began treating them as responsibilities. At HOA meetings, she spoke less and listened more. When neighbors raised concerns, she didn't interrupt or dominate. She took notes. She asked questions. And slowly, people began seeing her not as the woman who tried to take control, but as someone learning to rebuild trust one small action at a time. I wasn't looking for friendship, but I did notice the change. When she walked past my house now, she didn't avoid eye contact. Instead, she offered a small nod, not an apology repeated, but a respectful acknowledgement that some lessons leave marks deeper than citations or fines. They reshape a person's sense of power. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of my driveway, looking at the smooth concrete that had sparked an entire storm. It wasn't just part of my home anymore, it was a reminder of why boundaries matter, and why standing firm doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that refuses to be provoked, that gathers truth, waits patiently, and lets the consequences speak when the moment finally arrives. Neighbors occasionally asked how it all ended, expecting drama, confrontation, or revenge. But I always told them the truth: it ended not with humiliation, but with understanding. Because the real victory wasn't the tow truck, the court ruling, or the cleared driveway, it was the moment entitlement met accountability, and respect finally took its place. Life moved forward. The street grew quieter. And the story of the stolen driveway became less of a conflict, and more of a lesson we all carried in our own way about pride, patience, and the strength it takes to stand your ground without losing yourself in the fight. Months passed, and the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm that felt natural again, almost ordinary. Cars came and went without incident, conversations flowed without tension, and my driveway remained a simple, unchallenged part of daily life. But beneath that calm, I carried a quiet understanding of what had truly happened. The story wasn't about the car, the citations, or even Karen's arrogance. It was about boundaries, patience, and the power of standing firm when someone believes rules don't apply to them. Karen, once a storm of entitlement, had changed in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. She no longer flaunted authority or tried to dominate the board meetings. She arrived prepared, spoke thoughtfully, and treated the neighborhood not as a stage for her ego, but as a shared community. Her nods when passing by weren't empty gestures, they were acknowledgement, respect earned the hard way. It was as if the battle over concrete had transformed her understanding of leadership and fairness. For me, the driveway itself became a symbol, proof that persistence, patience, and careful planning could overcome arrogance without resorting to anger. I often shared the story with neighbors, not to boast, but to illustrate a principle: entitlement can be challenged. Rules, when followed, matter. And consequences, delivered consistently and calmly, can teach lessons far more memorable than anger or confrontation ever could. Even Karen seemed to understand, in her own quiet way, that the lesson wasn't personal. It was universal. Power without respect is fragile. Arrogance without accountability collapses eventually. And when someone like her believes they are untouchable, sometimes the only response is preparation, patience, and a steady hand, letting evidence and procedure speak louder than any shout could. Looking back now, I don't remember the anger, the tension, or even the frustration. I remember the clarity I gained, the patience I honed, and the way truth always prevails when given time and care. My driveway wasn't just a piece of property anymore, it was a testament to strategy, perseverance, and the quiet satisfaction of doing things the right way. And as I parked my car there one last time in that chapter of the story, I smiled, not because Karen had been proven wrong, not because victory had been mine, but because a neighborhood had learned, a boundary had been restored, and a lesson would linger far longer than a moment of chaos ever could.